Hello there, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Murder at the Chamber of Commerce. Hello there. Did you ever hear the story of the murder at the Chamber of Commerce dinner? I guess not. In fact, the story itself got to us only a few days ago when the Grays Harbor old-timer photographer B.B. Jones stopped to yarn about early day happenings that he could recall, and he got onto the subject of a shooting at the Hoquiam Chamber of Commerce dinner in 1914. It's a story that several old-timers recall with a chuckle. I've talked to a few who were there that night, and they can still hear the sound of the shot and the reaction of the crowd that filled the dining room at the old Grayport Hotel, even though they hadn't thought of the incident for years. So when George Edgar has taken the customary few seconds for our sponsor, we'll put the facts together along with the recollections of a few old-timers and give you B.B. Jones' story of the exciting night at the Chamber of Commerce dinner. Now in 1914, Claude McClure was city editor of the Hoquiam Washingtonian with the extracurricular activity of secretary of the Hoquiam Commercial Club. And during a portion of each day, McClure kept the office of the club open in the old First National Bank building on the corner of 8th and I Street. The Commercial Club, as old-timers don't need to be told, is the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce today. But in those long-ago days, such local booster organizations all had their own titles. Some were called Boards of Trade, others Trade Bureaus, and in Hoquiam, it was the Commercial Club. The idea was the same, to boost the town, to organize the business and professional men of the community into a body that had the town's best interest at heart and could lend weight to any community campaign or program. About once a year, the Hoquiam Commercial Club held its annual dinner, and along with the organized eating and drinking, the speakers chosen to keynote the affair laid out the future of the community with flowery gusto. And it was time for great expansive predictions, and the speakers never missed their opportunity. Well, in 1914, at the dinner of the Commercial Club came along, and Secretary McClure laid the plans for the big event, working with the club's president, Phil Morant. An elaborate program was laid out. The old Grayport Hotel dining room was chosen as the setting for the affair, and Hoquiam was informed that the Commercial Club's annual dinner would be the biggest and best ever staged. Now, the sequence of our story needs a little revising right here. If we were to tell you all the plans that were made, you would be too far ahead of the crowd that filled up the Hoquiam dining room that night in 1914 for the big event. It was a jolly crowd in those days before Prohibition that had pulled the spikes out of Grays Harbor's busy bars. The members of the club were embedded with sharpening their tongues and loosen their nerves with small portions of the old sharp mellow whiskey. And the hall full of Hoquiam citizens, with a sprinkling of representatives from neighboring towns around the harbor, was in the mood for fun. When the guests had been introduced, Billy Peterson, Phil Locke, and Mayor Eugene France were among those invited from Aberdeen, and the waiters had kept the table well served with cold bottles of assorted beers. The club got on with its prepared program, and there were some musical numbers and monologues, and then Phil Morant, the club's president, rose for the occasion and said a few words on the future of the city. The next speaker was Hoquiam attorney Will Campbell, a native son whose heart was in the future of Hoquiam. Campbell was not slow to launch into a real booster speech. He saw the harbor cities growing with leaps and bounds, the Panama Canal, the growth of the West Coast, our timber resources, the organized and intelligent efforts of the community to improve themselves. All these were given as reasons for having faith in Hoquiam. He painted a rosy future and was interrupted from time to time by bursts of applause from enthusiastic audiences. And finally, when he had lifted the boosters to a fever-high pitch, a round of cheers had stopped him. He paused and leaned forward to address his audience on what was obviously a more intimate terms. But we can't build a great city. We can't prosper, grow, and thrive with men like Phil Morant holding back our progress, he said. There was fire in his eyes. It was as though someone had insulted the national flag. No pin could have dropped in that room without being heard. Morant had been our president, the speaker continued, and when we have needed leadership, direction, intelligence, and productive ideas and constructive efforts, he has given us self-interest that served only his own purpose. Every project he backs is aimed at putting dollars in his own pocket, Campbell said slowly and deliberately. He boxed the new jetty to provide work for the pile drivers and scows. He thumps for paved streets to make a market for his sand and gravel. Morant was president of the Grays Harbor Construction Company. If we are to build something here worth passing on to our children, we must have leadership that is more competent and less self-interested than such a man as Phil Morant can provide. The speaker stopped. Out of the corner of their eyes, every man in the room was anxiously watching the club's president, Phil Morant, whose face was a burning red. He fumbled nervously with a watch charm that hung on his checkered vest. As the speakers paused, Morant leapt to his feet. I have tried to serve this organization well and honorably, he began. And as you men are my witness, I have been deliberately insulted by a cowardly attack as any man has ever received. I have the right to an apology and I demand it. He faced his accuser across the sea of upturned faces and through the blue smoke of the old Grayport dining room. And I spoke only what every honest man in this room knows is true, Campbell shouted back. I won't apologize to you or any man like you, he snarled. The big crowd was tense. Now the level of the feud was descending. Morant shouted at Campbell and Campbell countered with references to Morant's predecessors. Twice members of the club started to get up to intervene, but Morant pushed them off and back and started towards the speaker across the dining room. Campbell reached out and seized an empty beer bottle standing on the table in front of him. Every man in the dining room leaned forward fearfully. Then, with a row of chairs and a table still separating them, Morant suddenly reached into his pocket and drew out a revolver. The biggest, wickedest revolver that many a man there had ever seen. Leveling at Campbell, he fired. The speaker seized his chest and dropped to the floor. Now, the dining room was plunged into confusion. W.L. Adams, president of Hoquiam's First National Bank, shouted, Phil, what have you done? Julius Baer, Hoquiam's clothier, dropped the coffee cup he had been nervously holding during the altercation. A few of the men nearest the speaker, when he fell, rushed to him. But he had rolled partway under the table, and they hesitated to touch him. Morant stood menacingly in the center of the room with the smoking revolver in his hand. It was the most awkward moment of many an old-timers can recall, even to this day. But some of the most observing of the audience noted that Morant had aimed high. Even in the beat of the embellagio, they had been able to reckon that the aim of the assailant, and they figured that no man could have hit another at that range as Morant had. And they were right. At the same moment of awkwardness, the victim rolled over on the floor and laughed. That was it. The laugh was the safety valve on the pressure that had built up, and the whole crowd caught the humor of the roughhouse stunt that had taken everyone in. Campbell and Morant were surrounded by friends, slapping them on the back and convulsed with laughter at their own predicament of a few seconds before. It was the highlight of the 1914 banquet, which broke up immediately afterwards, and all Grays Harbor heard the story of the prank and had a laugh about it. Secretary McClure admitted that Will Campbell's office, just down the hall from his, had made it convenient to cook up the stunt, and they had hatched the plot during the idle moments a few days before. Now, George, a few words from our sponsor. The public shooting stunt had been worked many times since by local pranksters, and possibly it was enacted somewhere else before Will Campbell and Phil Morant chilled the blood of the Hoquiam Commercial Club with a Dead Man Act that night in 1914. But none of those who saw the dramatic shooting in Hoquiam's old Grayport Hotel had ever seen it before, and they swear to this day that it was the original, with the two Hoquiam men who staged its production. All such events since, they claim, are only mediocre imitations of the real thing. As for Will Campbell, he carried the mark of his part in the show for years after. In recalling the story the other day, B.B. Jones remembered that at least 5 years later, Campbell rose to speak before the group of men and was greeted with roars of laughter when he began his remarks with, "Is Phil Morant in the house? If he is, I won't say a word." And that's the story of the shooting at the Grayport Motel, as recalled by old-timers who were there, that we find tonight as a wonderful page in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.